Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. My name is Henry, and I have been backpacking in the Pacific Northwest for more than a decade. I always follow the rules, obtain the proper permits, and strictly respect leave no trace principles. I am telling you this because what I discovered in the wilderness area of Olympic National Park challenged everything I thought I knew about the way our protected lands are managed and about who else might be using them. It was late September when I applied for a backcountry permit to do a solo hike through the Quinault River drainage. It is a restricted area that requires advance permits, limited to only a few people or groups per day, with the goal of protecting a very delicate ecosystem. I had been trying to get a permit for that particular route for 3 years, and when one finally became available because of a cancellation, I did not hesitate for a second to take the opportunity. The permit was for 4 days and 3 nights, allowing me to go deep into old-growth forest and camp at designated sites within the backcountry area. I had researched the area thoroughly, studied topographic maps, and read reports from other hikers. Everything indicated that it would be a spectacular wilderness experience inside one of the most pristine forest ecosystems still remaining in the lower 48 states. I arrived at the ranger station on a Thursday morning to pick up my permit and receive the mandatory briefing before entering the remote area. The ranger who processed my documents seemed unusually serious as she went over the regulations with me. She emphasized several times that I had to camp only at the assigned sites, that the permit system existed to protect sensitive areas, and that I should immediately report any violations or strange activity to park authorities. When I asked her whether they had been having problems with unauthorized camps in the area, she hesitated before answering that they occasionally dealt with people entering restricted areas without permission. She advised me to stay aware of my surroundings and trust my instincts if something seemed out of place. I began my hike around 10 in the morning, following the established trail toward the Quinault River drainage. For the first few kilometers, the trail was well maintained and passed through second-growth forest before entering the true wilderness area, where ancient cedars and Douglas firs towered overhead. The forest had an almost cathedral-like silence, with rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy and illuminating patches of moss and ferns on the ground. My first designated campsite was located approximately 8 miles from the trailhead, beside a small stream that provided access to water. According to my permit, I was the only person authorized to camp in that drainage for the next 3 days. That solitude was precisely part of what made those permits so valuable and so difficult to obtain. I reached the planned campsite around 4 in the afternoon, with plenty of time to set up my tent and explore the surroundings before dark. The site itself was a small clearing next to the stream, with an established fire ring and a bear-proof food storage box. Everything looked exactly as the park materials had described. But when I started setting up my tent, I noticed something that unsettled me. There were signs of recent camping activity that did not match the official records. The fire ring contained fresh ashes and partially burned wood that could not have been more than a few days old. Even more concerning, I found tent stakes driven into the ground that had clearly been used recently, and the vegetation around the area showed obvious signs of human traffic. According to the permit system, no one should have camped at that site for at least 2 weeks. The ranger station keeps meticulous records of backcountry use, and they would have informed me if there had been recent activity in the area. I decided to investigate a little more before setting up my own camp. Following the stream downstream, I discovered more evidence of recent human presence. There were other fire rings that did not appear on any official campsite map, areas where vegetation had been cleared to place tents, and even some improvised furniture built from fallen logs. Someone had been camping in that restricted area without permits, and not only that, they had established what appeared to be semi-permanent camps in places where overnight stays were supposed to be completely prohibited. As I continued exploring, I found a trail branching off from the official hiking route. That path was not marked on any of the maps I had with me and showed signs of frequent use, even though it was in an area where traveling off-trail was prohibited. The trail led deeper into the drainage, toward zones designated as research areas with no public access allowed. After following that unauthorized trail for approximately half a mile, I reached a larger camp that had clearly been in use for an extended period of time. There were several fire rings, multiple tent clearings, food storage containers that were not the approved bear-proof models, and even some basic shelters built from tarps and forest materials. This was not the casual camp of someone who had accidentally wandered into a restricted area. It was an established camp, with evidence of repeated and prolonged use by people who knew exactly where they were and had decided to completely ignore the permit system. But what disturbed me most was not the unauthorized camp itself, but what I found scattered around the area. There were dozens of empty food containers, but not the kind backpackers usually carry. They were institutional-size cans and packages, the kind used by large groups or commercial operations. I also found equipment that seemed completely out of place for a recreational camp. Heavy-duty generators, several radio antennas, and electronic equipment that would have required significant power sources. Most unsettling of all was discovering what appeared to be research materials. There were waterproof containers filled with data sheets, photographs, and scientific instruments I did not recognize. Some of the documentation had official-looking letterheads, but the text was partially blurred by water damage, and I could not clearly read the details. While I was examining those materials, I heard voices approaching from deep in the forest. I immediately withdrew from the unauthorized camp and returned toward the official trail as quickly and quietly as I could. The voices were too far away for me to distinguish words, but I could tell there were several people and that they were heading toward the area I had just been investigating. I reached my designated campsite and quickly set up my tent, trying to give the impression that I had been there all afternoon. My hands were shaking as I assembled the shelter, both from adrenaline and from the growing realization that I had stumbled onto something much more complex than simple permit violations. The voices I had heard never came close enough to my official campsite for me to see who they belonged to, but throughout the afternoon and part of the night, I could occasionally hear them in the distance. Sometimes they seemed to come from the unauthorized camp I had discovered. Other times they sounded as if they were moving along trails that did not exist on any official map. I spent a sleepless night inside my tent, listening to sounds that suggested ongoing activity in areas where no one should have been. From time to time, there were mechanical noises like generators running or vehicles starting, something that should have been impossible in an area designated as wilderness with no road access. Around 3 a.m, I heard something that clearly sounded like helicopters passing overhead. That was extremely unusual, since flights over wilderness areas are heavily regulated and generally occur only in cases of emergency rescues or official park matters. When dawn came, I made a decision that went against every backpacking instinct I had developed over the years. I decided to cancel the trip and get out of there immediately. I broke camp as quickly as I could and began hiking toward the trailhead, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any sign that someone might be following me. The 8-mile hike back felt longer than any distance I had ever traveled before. I did not feel safe until I reached my vehicle in the parking lot. I drove directly to the ranger station and requested a meeting with the backcountry supervisor. I detailed everything I had observed: the unauthorized camps, the evidence of prolonged occupation, the research materials, and the nighttime activity suggesting ongoing operations inside restricted areas. The ranger who listened to my report took many notes and asked me detailed questions about locations and descriptions. However, her responses seemed carefully measured, as if she was being cautious about the information she shared with me. When I asked what actions would be taken to investigate the unauthorized activity, she told me that park officials would review the matter, but that I should not expect to receive updates about their findings. She also advised me not to talk about what I had observed with other hikers or on social media, explaining that premature disclosure could interfere with any law enforcement action. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the National Park Service thanking me for my report and informing me that appropriate measures had been taken to address the violations I had witnessed. No details were provided about what those measures had been or what they had discovered during the investigation. I tried to obtain another permit for the same area 6 months later, but I was told that the Quinault River drainage had been temporarily closed to all public access due to ongoing resource management activities. The closure notice did not provide any estimated date for reopening to the public. 18 months have now passed since my experience in the Olympic wilderness, and that section of the park remains closed to backcountry camping. I have tried several times to get information about the status of the place, but park officials only say that the closure is necessary for resource protection and that they cannot provide a reopening date. I still backpack in other areas of the Pacific Northwest, but I have never again encountered anything like what I observed in the Quinault drainage. The experience profoundly changed the way I understand how our public lands are used and managed. I understood that there are probably legitimate scientific and administrative activities taking place in wilderness areas out of public view, but what I witnessed did not feel like authorized government research or normal park management operations. The secrecy, the unauthorized camps, and the immediate closure of the area after my report suggested something much more complex and potentially concerning. I have never received a satisfactory explanation for what I found during those 4 days in September. The unauthorized activity, the research materials, and the subsequent closure of the area remain unexplained. Sometimes I wonder if I stumbled onto something I was never supposed to see, and whether my report was truly welcomed by park authorities, or whether it instead created complications for activities they preferred to keep hidden. What I do know for certain is that our wilderness areas are not always as wild or as protected as the public believes. There are people operating in restricted zones with apparent impunity, carrying out activities that seem to contradict the very purpose of the wilderness designation. I still obtain permits and follow all regulations every time I go backpacking, but I no longer assume that I am alone in nature simply because the permit system says I should be. Story 2. My name is Evelyn, and what I am about to tell you happened during what was supposed to be a romantic anniversary getaway with my boyfriend Jack. We had been together for 3 years, and winter camping had become a shared passion. We were experienced cold weather campers and had already successfully completed expeditions in temperatures far below zero. But what happened to us that February night in the Boundary Waters, Minnesota, not only destroyed our relationship, but also my ability to trust my own perception of reality. Jack and I had planned that trip for months. February marked our 3rd anniversary, and we wanted to celebrate it somewhere special. In winter, the Boundary Waters canoe area wilderness transforms into a frozen, pure, untouched landscape that very few people ever get to experience. We had already camped there twice during the warmer months, but doing it in winter offered an entirely different kind of beauty and solitude. We drove from Minneapolis on a Friday afternoon, loaded with gear designed for extreme cold conditions. Our equipment list was extensive: a 4-season mountaineering tent, sleeping bags rated for temperatures down to minus 30 degrees, insulated sleeping pads, a portable winter shelter, and enough food for 4 days. We also carried emergency gear, including a satellite communicator, first aid supplies, and extra layers of clothing. When we reached the parking area, the temperature was minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill dropping to minus 25. That was within our comfort range. We had camped in worse conditions and had full confidence in our skills and our gear. The weather forecast called for stable cold over the next 3 days, with no precipitation expected. We began skiing into the wilderness area around 3 in the afternoon, pulling our gear behind us on sleds designed for winter camping. The snow was deep and well packed, which made the skiing conditions excellent. Our destination was a small island located approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, a place we had researched in great detail and knew would offer good protection from the wind and flat ground for setting up the tent. The ski trip was perfect. We moved at a very good pace despite the weight of the sleds, and the scenery was breathtaking. The lakes were completely frozen, covered by a layer of snow that stretched untouched to the horizon. The silence was profound, interrupted only by the sound of our skis cutting through the snow and our breathing in the frozen air. We reached the planned campsite around 5:30, just as the sun was beginning to set. The island was exactly what we had hoped for, a small wooded area with several level spaces suitable for camping. We chose a site among a group of large pines that would protect us from the wind while still keeping us away from any dangerous dead branches that could fall from above. Setting up camp in those conditions required teamwork and careful attention to every detail. We had done it enough times to move with practiced efficiency. Jack began packing down a platform in the snow for our tent, while I organized the gear and prepared the area. The wind was minimal, and the temperature felt manageable thanks to our layered clothing system. Our tent went up without any problem. It was a very high-quality four-season shelter that we had used many times before. We secured it with additional guy lines and snow anchors, making sure it could withstand any gusts that might come during the night. By 7, we had the camp ready and were heating water for dinner on our reliable winter stove. The night began perfectly. We cooked a hot meal, shared a thermos of hot chocolate, and spent a good while talking and enjoying the incredible night sky. At that latitude in winter, with no light pollution, the stars shone in a way that is impossible to describe. We could see the Milky Way clearly, and even the northern lights appeared briefly as green curtains dancing over the northern horizon. We retreated into the tent around 9, settling into our sleeping bags with books and headlamps. That had always been one of my favorite parts of winter camping. The cozy warmth inside the tent while the frozen world existed only inches away, on the other side of the thin fabric walls. Jack and I spoke softly about our plans for the next day and how grateful we were to be able to share experiences like that. The first sign that something was wrong came around 11. Jack suddenly sat up inside his sleeping bag and asked me if I had heard something. I had not heard anything, but I listened carefully. After a minute or two, I heard it too. It was the sound of something moving through the snow around our camp. It had a rhythm, like footsteps, but it was heavier than what a person would produce. We both remained silent, listening with absolute concentration. The sound continued for several minutes, seeming to circle our tent at a distance of perhaps 20 or 30 feet. Then it stopped completely. Jack whispered that it was probably a deer or a moose moving through the area. That made sense. Large animals move around at night, and we were in their habitat. We had encountered wildlife on previous camping trips, and it had never been a problem. But there was something about the movement pattern that unsettled me. It was too regular, too deliberate, and it had definitely been circling our camp, which is uncommon behavior for most animals. We settled back in, but neither of us could fall asleep easily. Every small sound seemed amplified by the cold air. The normal creaks and settling of the tent in the wind sounded threatening. Even our own breathing seemed too loud in the middle of that stillness. Around midnight, our stove failed. We had been using the same stove for 2 years without any problems. It was a high-quality winter model, designed specifically for cold weather conditions. But when Jack tried to light it to melt snow for drinking water, it did not work properly. The flame was weak and uneven, and it kept going out again and again, despite his repeated attempts to adjust the settings. That was concerning because staying hydrated in winter conditions is essential. We needed to be able to melt snow for water, and we needed hot drinks to preserve our core body temperature. Jack worked on the stove for 20 minutes, trying different adjustments and checking every connection, but he could not get it to function reliably. We decided to use our backup stove, a smaller model we carried for emergencies. But when Jack tried to light it, we discovered that it did not work either. The igniter clicked, but no flame appeared. That should have been impossible. We had tested both stoves before the trip, and they had worked perfectly. Now we were facing a serious situation. Without a working stove, we could not melt snow for water or prepare food or hot drinks. In sub-zero temperatures, that could quickly become a potentially life-threatening problem. We still had some water left in our bottles, but not enough to get through the entire next day. Jack suggested that we might have to consider cutting the trip short and skiing back in the morning. It was disappointing, but it was the prudent decision given the equipment failures. However, we still had to make it safely through the current night. It was while we were discussing our options that the temperature inside the tent began to drop drastically. That made no sense. Our tent was designed for extremely cold weather, and we were both inside high-quality sleeping bags. According to our thermometer, the outside temperature had not changed significantly. But inside the tent, I could see my breath forming thick clouds, and I could feel the icy air somehow penetrating our shelter. Jack checked the tent for tears or openings that might be letting in the cold. He found nothing. All the zippers were closed and there were no visible holes in the fabric. Even so, the temperature continued dropping. We put on additional layers of clothing and tightened the sleeping bags more closely around our bodies, but the cold seemed to seep through everything. Then we started to hear the breathing. It was not our breathing. It came from outside the tent, slow, deep, and deliberate. Something was standing very close to our shelter, close enough for us to clearly hear its breathing. The sound moved around the perimeter of the tent, sometimes stopping just outside the spot where our heads were. Jack grabbed the flashlight and opened the tent door. The beam of light revealed nothing but untouched snow and the dark shapes of the trees. But the instant he turned on the light, the sound of the breathing stopped completely. We waited 10 minutes before closing the tent again. Only moments after zipping the door shut, the breathing returned. That pattern continued for the next 3 hours. Every time we investigated with the light, we found nothing. Every time we returned inside the tent, the sounds came back. Sometimes the breathing was accompanied by other noises, the sound of something large moving through the snow, occasional scraping against the tent fabric, and once something that clearly sounded like sniffing, as if something were trying to identify our scent. By 4 in the morning, we were both showing signs of hypothermia despite our high-quality gear. Our core body temperatures were dropping, and we were shaking uncontrollably. That should not have been happening with the equipment we had, or with our level of experience, but our bodies were losing heat faster than they could generate it. Jack made the decision to activate our emergency satellite communicator and request rescue. Under normal circumstances, he made the decision to activate our emergency satellite communicator and request rescue. Under normal circumstances, that would have been embarrassing for experienced winter campers like us. But something was fundamentally wrong with our situation, and our lives could have been at risk. The rescue team reached us at 8 in the morning, skiing in with an emergency sled and additional equipment to warm us. They found us both with mild hypothermia and dehydration. What they could not explain was why our equipment had failed so completely, or why we had lost so much body heat in conditions that should have been manageable. The paramedics were baffled by our stoves, which worked perfectly when they tested them. Our tent showed no signs of damage or air leaks. According to all the physical evidence, our equipment was functioning exactly as it should have been. And yet we had nearly died from cold exposure while using gear that should have kept us safe and warm. The rescue team skied us out to the parking area, where we were evaluated by medical personnel and discharged after warming up and rehydrating. Physically, we recovered completely within a few hours. Psychologically, the damage was permanent. Jack and I never camped together again. We tried to talk about what happened, but we were never able to agree on an explanation. He believed it had been a combination of equipment failure and panic that had caused us to overreact to normal winter camping challenges. I knew something had been stalking us that night, something that had deliberately sabotaged our equipment and had systematically tried to push us into hypothermia. Our relationship ended 2 months later. Some experiences reveal fundamental differences in the way people perceive reality, and what happened to us in the Boundary Waters was one of those experiences. I never went winter camping again. The memory of that breathing in the darkness and the certainty that something had tried to kill us through cold and fear forever changed my relationship with the wilderness. Story 3. My name is Abigail, and this story has to do with me and my boyfriend Samuel. We are what many people would call overlanders, people who prefer to seek out remote camping spots accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles instead of staying in established campgrounds. For 5 years, we have been exploring Forest Service roads throughout the Pacific Northwest, searching for solitude and untouched campsites far from the crowds. What happened to us on a remote Forest Service road in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon forever changed the way we approach camping in wilderness areas. It was early October when Samuel and I decided to explore an area of the Willamette National Forest that we had never visited before. We had spent weeks studying Forest Service maps and satellite images, identifying a network of forest roads that seemed to provide access to high-elevation meadows and old-growth forest areas. Those roads appeared marked on the maps, but they did not show recent maintenance dates, which usually indicated little traffic and excellent opportunities for dispersed camping. Our vehicle was very well prepared for traveling Forest Service roads. A lifted pickup truck with four-wheel drive, oversized tires, recovery gear, and a complete camping setup in the back. We carried enough food, water, and fuel for a week of self-sufficient camping, along with communication equipment, including a satellite messenger for emergencies. We left Portland on a Friday afternoon, driving east toward the Cascade Mountains. Our plan was to access the Forest Service road network from Highway 22, then explore several secondary routes until we found a suitable place to camp for the weekend. The weather forecast was favorable, with clear skies and mild temperatures expected for the next 3 days. The first part of the trip went exactly as we had planned. We left the highway and took Forest Service Road 2261, a well-maintained gravel road that provided access to several trailheads leading into wilderness areas. Traffic was light, made up mostly of other hikers and weekend campers heading toward established camping areas. After approximately 15 miles, we turned onto a smaller forest road that branched north toward our target area. That road was narrower and showed less maintenance, but it was still easily passable with our vehicle. The forest around us was beautiful, with dense stands of Douglas firs and occasional clearings that offered views of distant peaks. As we traveled deeper into the Forest Service road system, the routes became progressively narrower and more difficult. We passed several intersections where our GPS showed multiple turnoffs, some of which were not identified with road numbers or destination signs. We carefully recorded our route, taking notes on landmarks and road conditions so we could find our way back to the main highway. Around 4 in the afternoon, we found what looked like an ideal campsite, a small meadow beside a stream, accessible by a short spur road that ended in a natural parking area. The place offered level ground for camping, access to water, and excellent views of the surrounding forest. Most importantly, it showed no signs of recent human activity, suggesting that we would have complete privacy for the weekend. Samuel parked the truck at the edge of the meadow, and we began setting up our camp. We organized the cooking area, unfolded our camping chairs, and prepared to enjoy a quiet afternoon in nature. Everything felt perfect. The place was exactly what we had hoped to find: beautiful, secluded, and completely private. When the sun began to set, we prepared dinner and opened a bottle of wine to celebrate finding such an excellent campsite. The silence was deep, interrupted only by the sound of water moving in the nearby stream and the occasional calls of birds settling in for the night. That was what we loved most about overlanding: the possibility of reaching places where we could experience true solitude and a direct connection with nature. It was around 8 when we first noticed the tire tracks. Samuel had gone down to the stream to collect water for washing the dishes when he called me over to look at something. In the soft dirt beside the water, there were fresh tire tracks that clearly had not been there when we arrived. The tracks belonged to a large vehicle, much larger than our truck, and led from the edge of the stream back toward the Forest Service road. That was confusing because we had not heard any vehicles pass near our location since we had arrived. The Forest Service road we used to access that area was the only route in, and it passed about 50 meters from our camp. Any vehicle large enough to leave those tracks should have been clearly audible as it approached and left. We followed the tire marks back toward the main road, using our flashlights to examine the ground carefully. The tracks were definitely recent, made within the last few hours, and showed tread patterns consistent with heavy truck or machinery tires. But when we reached the forest road, the marks seemed to disappear on the harder, more compacted surface. Samuel suggested that maybe we had missed the vehicle passing while we were busy setting up camp or preparing dinner. It was the most logical explanation, although neither of us could understand how we had failed to hear a large truck passing so close to us. We returned to our campsite, but the discovery of those mysterious tracks had created an undercurrent of unease that affected the rest of the night. We started paying more attention to the sounds of the forest, trying to distinguish between normal wildlife activity and any indication of human presence in the area. Around 10, we decided to go to sleep. We had a comfortable sleeping setup in the back of the truck, which gave us both security and elevation above the ground. As experienced overlanders, we always felt safer sleeping inside the vehicle than in a tent pitched on the ground when camping in remote places. At approximately midnight, we were awakened by the sound of vehicles. Not just one, but several vehicles moving slowly along the Forest Service road without headlights. We could hear the low rumble of diesel engines and the sound of tires on gravel. But when we looked out the truck windows, we saw no lights in the darkness. Samuel carefully opened the truck door and stepped outside to get a better view of the road. He whispered to me that he could hear at least 3 separate vehicles moving in a convoy formation, all traveling without any visible lights. The sound grew louder as they approached our area, then began to fade as they continued past our location. We stayed awake and alert for the next hour, listening for any sign that the vehicles might return or that someone might approach our camp. The forest returned to its normal nighttime silence, with only the usual sounds of the wind, the trees, and the water in the stream. In the morning, we investigated the stretch of forest road where we had heard the vehicles pass. On the compacted gravel, we found fresh tire tracks from several large vehicles. The marks were deep and clear, indicating heavy loads, and they showed the same tread patterns we had found beside the stream the night before. Even more unsettling was discovering that some of the tracks led toward a Forest Service road that, according to our maps, was listed as permanently closed. There was a metal gate across that road, with official Forest Service signs indicating that access was prohibited. But the gate was open, and the lock appeared to have been recently cut. Samuel wanted to investigate further, but I insisted that we should leave the area immediately. Whatever activity was taking place on those remote roads after midnight, with multiple heavy vehicles traveling without lights, was not something recreational campers should get involved in. We were packing up camp when we noticed that someone was watching us. There was a man standing among the trees, approximately 100 yards from our camp. He was not trying to hide, but he was not approaching or making any effort to communicate with us either. He simply stood there watching our activities while we packed up the gear. Samuel called out a greeting to him, but the man did not respond. When Samuel began walking toward the tree line, the man backed deeper into the forest and disappeared from our view. We checked the area where he had been standing and found clear evidence that someone had been watching our camp for an extended period of time. The vegetation was flattened in a pattern that suggested a person had been sitting or crouching in that spot for hours. That discovery significantly accelerated our preparations to leave. We loaded the truck as quickly as possible and drove back toward the main Forest Service road, constantly checking the mirrors for any sign that someone was following us. When we reached the first major intersection, we encountered a problem that confirmed our decision to leave immediately had been the right one. A large tree had been dropped across the Forest Service road, completely blocking the route we intended to use to return to the highway. The tree had clearly been cut recently, since the sawdust was still fresh and the cut showed obvious chainsaw marks. Someone had deliberately blocked the road after we had passed through there the day before. Fortunately, Samuel had been carefully recording our route, and he remembered an alternate Forest Service road that should connect us back to the highway system. However, that alternate route forced us to drive deeper into the area where we had observed the mysterious vehicle activity during the night. We had no choice but to take that road. As we advanced along the narrow forest road, we passed several places where we saw clear evidence of recent heavy vehicle traffic and some kind of industrial activity. There were areas where vegetation had been cleared, deep tire ruts in soft ground, and even some temporary structures that looked like equipment storage facilities. The most disturbing thing was that we passed 2 places where armed men dressed in civilian clothing were stationed beside the road. They made no attempt to stop us, but they watched our truck closely as we passed, and I had the distinct impression that they were recording our license plate number. We reached the highway without further incident, but the drive back to Portland was tense and almost completely silent. Both Samuel and I felt that we had accidentally stumbled onto some kind of illegal operation, and we were not sure what steps we should take. After discussing it for a long time, we decided to report our observations to the Forest Service. We contacted the district ranger office and described the blocked road, the evidence of unauthorized vehicle activity, and the armed individuals we had encountered. The Forest Service representative we spoke with took detailed notes and thanked us for the report. However, when we asked what kind of investigation would be carried out, we were told that the information would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities, but that we should not expect to be contacted for follow-up. Samuel and I still explore Forest Service roads throughout the Pacific Northwest, but we have never returned to that area of the Willamette National Forest. We also changed our camping practices, incorporating more careful research about recent reports of activity in the areas we plan to visit, and paying much closer attention to signs that certain places may be used for purposes other than recreation. The experience taught us that remote Forest Service roads are not always as uninhabited as they appear on maps, and that activities take place in our national forests that recreational users are not meant to witness. Story 4. I have always considered myself an experienced mountaineer. Over the last 15 years, I have conquered peaks in the Rockies, in the Cascades, and I have even attempted to climb Denali twice. I am not saying this to brag, but to make it clear that what happened to me on Mount Elbert in Colorado cannot be dismissed as the hallucinations of an inexperienced climber or someone affected by altitude sickness. My name is Luke, and what I experienced at 11,000 feet of elevation forever changed my relationship with the mountains. It was early February when I decided to attempt a winter ascent of Mount Elbert. The weather forecast showed a brief window of clear skies, and I had spent months planning that solo expedition. Winter mountaineering had always been my specialty. There is something deeply peaceful about the silence of snow-covered summits, about the way the world becomes muffled, pure, and untouched. I had already successfully completed winter ascents before, including several 14ers in similar conditions. This should have been routine. I began my ascent at 4 a.m, with my headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as I moved along the trail covered in packed snow. The temperature was around minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, but my gear was prepared for conditions much worse. I carried my usual winter setup: insulated mountaineering boots, a 4-season tent, a minus 20-degree sleeping bag, and enough food for 3 days. The weight of the backpack felt familiar and reassuring on my shoulders. The first hours of climbing went exactly as I expected. I made good progress despite the deep snow, following the established winter route with my GPS and a compass as backup. The sun rose behind the eastern peaks, tinting the snow with brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of morning that reminds you why you seek these experiences, why you push your body to the limit in search of something almost transcendent. By midday, I had reached the tree line, approximately 10,000 feet. That is where the landscape changes from forested slopes to the harsh, wind-scoured terrain of the alpine zone. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and the wind had increased considerably. I stopped to add another layer of clothing and check my position. According to my GPS, I was making very good progress and should reach my planned campsite well before nightfall. The area where I planned to camp was a small, relatively protected spot at 11,000 feet. It was still below the summit, but high enough that the final push the next morning would be manageable. I had researched that point very carefully, studying topographic maps and reading reports from other winter climbers. It offered some protection from the prevailing winds while still maintaining access to the route toward the summit. As I continued climbing, the terrain became increasingly demanding. The snow was deeper than expected, and at times reached above my knees even while I was using snowshoes. Every step required deliberate effort, and I could feel my heart rate elevated from the combination of physical exertion and altitude. But that was normal. That was what I had trained for. I reached the site where I planned to camp around 3 p.m, with enough time to set up camp before darkness fell. The place seemed perfect. A small depression on the mountainside that offered protection from the wind, with relatively level ground for placing my tent. The snow was compact enough to support my weight without needing too much digging. Setting up camp at altitude and in winter conditions is a methodical process that cannot be rushed. I began by packing down a platform for the tent, then carefully assembled the structure, making sure every stake was firmly fixed and every guy line properly tightened. The wind was steady but manageable, producing that familiar whistle as it moved over the exposed ridges above me. When the sun began to disappear behind the western peaks, I finished setting up camp and prepared dinner on my compact stove. The routine of melting snow for water, heating my food, and organizing my gear for the night gave me a sense of normalcy and control. I had done that dozens of times before. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Darkness fell quickly at that altitude, as it usually does in the mountains during winter. I got into the tent around 7, settling into my sleeping bag with a book and my headlamp. Outside, the wind kept its steady rhythm, with occasional gusts strong enough to make the tent walls flex. It was expected, and I was not worried. It was around 9 when I heard the sound for the first time. At first, I dismissed it as wind moving between rock formations, or perhaps snow settling. It was a low, resonant tone that seemed to come from somewhere above my position. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that the sound had a pattern. It rose and fell in pitch, sometimes for several seconds, then stopped completely before starting again. I unzipped the tent and looked outside. The night was clear, with stars shining intensely in the thin air. The moon was almost full and cast enough light for me to clearly see the surrounding terrain. Everything seemed normal. The sound had stopped. I returned to my sleeping bag, convincing myself that it was simply an acoustic phenomenon I had not encountered before. Mountains produce strange sounds, especially at night, when temperature differences cause rock to expand and contract. I had heard rockfalls, avalanches, and cracking ice. It was probably something similar. But the sound returned an hour later, and this time it was closer. The tone was now deeper, more vibrant, and seemed to be moving. It began from one direction and then shifted toward another, as if the source were circling my camp. I grabbed my headlamp and went outside again, examining the area systematically. The beam of light reached perhaps 50 meters in the clear air, illuminating only snow and rock formations. The sound stopped the instant I turned on the light. I remained standing outside the tent for 15 minutes, listening and watching. Around me were the normal sounds of a night in the mountains, the wind passing over stone, the occasional creak of settling snow, the distant hoot of an owl from far below the tree line. But that strange resonant tone did not return while I was outside. I went back inside, but sleep became impossible. Every few minutes the sound returned. Sometimes it seemed to come directly from above my position, as if something were moving along the ridgeline over my head. Other times it seemed to originate in the valley below, rising like an echo up the slope in a way that made it impossible to determine its exact location. Around midnight, the pattern changed. Instead of the long, sustained tones, I began to hear something that sounded like voices. Not words I could understand, but clearly vocal sounds, with the cadence and rhythm of speech. There were multiple voices, sometimes overlapping, sometimes responding to one another in something that resembled a conversation. That was when my rational mind began to struggle to process what I was experiencing. I knew I was alone on that mountain. The winter climbing season meant very few people attempted those peaks, and I had not seen any other vehicles at the trailhead. The nearest maintained trail was miles away, and the terrain between my position and any other possible camping area was extremely difficult to travel, especially at night. But I was hearing voices. I forced myself to consider logical explanations. Sound travels strangely at altitude, especially in cold, thin air. Maybe I was hearing voices from a much greater distance than seemed possible. Maybe there were other climbers on a distant summit, and the acoustic properties of the terrain were carrying their conversation to my location. That explanation calmed me for approximately 10 minutes, until I realized that the voices were responding to my movements. When I changed position inside the tent, the voices stopped. When I stayed still, they began again. When I unzipped the tent to look outside, the silence was immediate. When I returned inside, the conversation started again after a few minutes. By 2 in the morning, I was questioning my own sanity. I had been at altitude for more than 12 hours, which was not enough to cause severe altitude sickness. But perhaps the combination of exertion, cold, and thin air was affecting my perception. I checked my pulse oximeter. My oxygen saturation was 92%, which was normal for that elevation. My heart rate was elevated, but that could easily be attributed to stress and adrenaline. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the voices began again. They seemed closer now, sometimes as if they were coming from just outside my tent. I could hear clear sounds of movement in the snow, the crunch of footsteps circling my camp. At 3:30 in the morning, something touched my tent. It was not the wind. The wind does not move with such deliberate pressure against the fabric from the outside, then shifts systematically around the perimeter. I could feel something following the outline of my shelter, running along the guy lines, testing the stability of the stakes. I grabbed my ice axe and headlamp, my heart pounding hard in my chest. Whatever was outside was large enough to exert noticeable pressure against the walls, and it moved with obvious intelligence and purpose. I shouted, "Hello? Is someone there?" The movement stopped instantly. I waited in absolute silence for 5 minutes before slowly unzipping the tent. The beam of my headlamp revealed untouched snow around my camp. There were no tracks, no disturbances of any kind. The snow was exactly as I had left it when I set up camp. But I knew something had been there. I had felt its presence, had felt the pressure of its movement against my tent. The physical evidence of my senses could not be completely wrong. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting upright inside my sleeping bag, with the ice axe across my knees, listening to sounds that defied all explanation and watching for movement that never materialized when I tried to look directly at it. When the sun finally rose, I broke camp as quickly as I could and began the descent. I never attempted to reach the summit. I never returned to winter mountaineering. Some experiences change you in a fundamental way, and what happened to me at 11,000 feet on Mount Elbert was one of those experiences. I still do not know what I encountered that night, but I know it was real, and I know it was not human. Story 5. My name is Dylan, and I have been kayak camping throughout the Great Lakes region for 8 years. I am an experienced paddler, and I have completed solo expeditions across Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan. I know the challenges of kayaking on the Great Lakes well: the sudden changes in weather, the cold water temperatures, and the isolation that comes with camping on remote islands located dozens of miles from shore. But what I experienced on a small island in northern Lake Michigan during a solo expedition last summer was unlike anything I had encountered in all my years of paddling in wild areas. I had planned a 10-day kayak expedition, completely alone, along the northern shore of Lake Michigan. My intention was to island hop among several small, uninhabited islets that offered primitive camping opportunities. Those islands are only accessible by boat and receive very few visitors because of their remote location and the demanding crossing required to reach them. My route was carefully planned to take advantage of good weather windows and to include escape options in case conditions became dangerous. I carried a full set of safety equipment, including a satellite communicator, marine radio, signal flares, and cold water survival gear. My kayak was loaded with food for 10 days, camping equipment, and drinking water. The first 3 days of the expedition went perfectly. I paddled approximately 20 miles per day, camping on 2 different islands that offered excellent places to set up, fresh water sources, and protection from the prevailing winds. The weather remained stable, with gentle winds and pleasant temperatures, ideal conditions for kayaking on the Great Lakes. On the 4th day, while I was paddling toward my planned destination, the weather began to deteriorate quickly. What had started as a calm morning with light winds soon turned into conditions with 4-foot waves and increasingly strong gusts. The forecast had not predicted that change, but Great Lakes weather is famously unpredictable. As conditions worsened, I realized that continuing toward my original destination would be dangerous. I needed to find shelter immediately before the waves grew too large to paddle safely. Consulting my navigation chart, I identified a small island located approximately 3 miles from my current position that could serve as emergency refuge. The paddle to the island was difficult, although still manageable. The waves continued to grow, and I had to calculate my approach very carefully to avoid being dragged against the rocky shore. I managed to land the kayak in a small protected cove on the leeward side of the island, and I dragged it well above the waterline before conditions deteriorated even further. The island was smaller than I had imagined when studying the charts, perhaps barely 2 acres in total. It was densely covered with mature pines and cedars, and it showed no obvious signs of recent human visits. There was no established campsite, but I found a relatively flat area among the trees where I could pitch my tent with some protection from the wind. While setting up camp, I discovered the first indication that the island had a disturbing history. As I cleared the space for my tent, I uncovered what appeared to be the remains of a stone foundation, partially covered by decades of fallen leaves and forest debris. The masonry was clearly human-made, but it seemed much older than anything one would expect to find on such a remote island. The stones were fitted together with a precision that suggested skilled work, and the foundation seemed to be the remnant of a structure that had been deliberately dismantled, not simply abandoned. I continued exploring the island while waiting for the weather to improve, and I made other discoveries that increased my discomfort with the place. Near the center of the island, I found what appeared to be a small cemetery. There were no headstones or markers, but the ground showed clear evidence of graves, rectangular depressions in the earth, arranged in orderly rows, each approximately 6 feet long. Some of those depressions were quite old, partially filled in with natural debris and covered by vegetation. Others looked much more recent, with disturbed soil and very little plant growth. Most disturbing of all was finding evidence that the cemetery was still in use. At the far end of the burial area, there were 2 graves that appeared to have been dug within the last few months. The soil was fresh, and tool marks could be seen in the ground around the sites. Someone had been bringing bodies to that remote island and burying them in that hidden cemetery, and they had done it recently. I also discovered remains of what seemed to have been a dock or landing area on the opposite side of the island, far from the place where I had made my emergency landing. The structure was almost completely collapsed, but remnants of wooden pilings and decking materials were still visible. That suggested the island had been accessible by boat in the past, and that someone had transported heavy materials or equipment to that place. As I continued investigating, I found more evidence of the island's dark history. There were rusty metal objects partially buried throughout the forest, tools, containers, and what appeared to be restraints or shackles. I also found remains of several buildings, identifiable only by their stone foundations and scattered debris. The weather conditions prevented me from leaving the island that day, so I was forced to spend the night in a place I increasingly suspected had been the scene of activities I did not want to understand. I set up my tent as far as possible from the cemetery area, but the island was so small that I could not escape the knowledge of what was hidden among the trees around me. When night fell, I found myself listening carefully to every sound, trying to distinguish between the normal noises of the forest and any sign that I was not alone on the island. Around midnight, I was awakened by sounds that confirmed my worst fears. I could hear the low rumble of a boat engine approaching the island. The sound grew louder and louder, suggesting that a large vessel was moving slowly through the darkness, without navigation lights. I remained inside my tent, too frightened to go out and investigate, but unable to ignore what was happening outside. The engine noise stopped, presumably when the vessel reached the collapsed dock area on the other side of the island. For the next hour, I could hear voices and the sounds of people moving through the forest. They were not trying to be quiet, and their conversation carried clearly through the still night air, although from my position I could not make out specific words. Most terrifying of all was that I could hear unmistakable sounds of digging. Someone was digging in the cemetery area, working methodically with shovels and other tools. The excavation continued for more than 2 hours, occasionally accompanied by conversation and the sound of heavy objects being moved. Finally, the activity stopped, and I heard the boat engine start again. The vessel left with the same discretion with which it had arrived, leaving me alone on the island with the certainty that I had witnessed something I was never supposed to see. I spent the rest of the night awake and terrified, afraid that the people who had been on the island might return, and also afraid of what I might discover if I investigated the cemetery area in daylight. When dawn came, the weather conditions had improved enough to attempt leaving. I broke camp as quickly as I could and prepared the kayak to launch, desperate to leave that island and its secrets behind. But before I left, I felt the need to confirm what had happened during the night. I walked to the cemetery area and found exactly what I feared: A new grave had been dug, filled in, and covered during the nighttime activity. The soil was fresh and there were clear signs that a body had been buried there. I also found more evidence that this was an ongoing operation. There were tool marks on the trees suggesting that the cemetery area was maintained and expanded regularly. I discovered a cache of digging tools hidden under a tarp, and I found what appeared to be a logbook wrapped in plastic and buried beneath a pile of stones. I did not examine the book in too much detail, but I could see that it contained dates, numbers, and what appeared to be location coordinates. That suggested the island cemetery was part of a systematic operation, with careful records of the burials. I left the island immediately and paddled hard toward the mainland, covering the remaining distance to my planned exit point in record time. The crossing was difficult because of the residual swell from the previous day's storm, but I was driven by an overwhelming need to reach civilization and report what I had discovered. When I reached shore, I contacted the local police and provided a detailed account of my observations. The officers who took my report seemed skeptical at first, but they showed more interest when I gave them the exact GPS coordinates of the island and described the evidence I had found. They told me that my report would be sent to the appropriate authorities and that an investigation would be conducted. But they also advised me not to speak publicly about my observations while the investigation was ongoing. Several weeks later, I received a brief communication informing me that authorities had visited the island and found evidence supporting my report. They gave me no details about the actions taken or what they discovered during their investigation. I have continued kayak camping throughout the Great Lakes, but I have never returned to that area of Lake Michigan. The experience profoundly changed my understanding of how remote islands can be used by people who prefer to carry out their activities away from public scrutiny. I understand that there may be legitimate explanations for part of what I observed, but the combination of the hidden cemetery, the burial activity during the night, and the systematic record-keeping suggested something far more sinister than simple illegal dumping or abandoned property. What I know for certain is that some of the most remote and seemingly uninhabited places in our Great Lakes region are not as empty as they appear on navigation charts. There are people who use those isolated sites for purposes they prefer to keep hidden from the general public, and recreational paddlers like me can accidentally stumble into situations that put us in danger. I still love kayak camping and exploring remote islands, but now I am much more careful about researching the history of places before visiting them, and I always make sure someone knows my exact route and my expected return date. Story 6. My name is Elizabeth, and I have been practicing alpine climbing in Colorado for 12 years. I am an experienced mountaineer, and I have reached the summit of more than 30 mountains above 14,000 feet, including several technical winter ascents. I know avalanche safety, weather assessment, and emergency procedures at high altitude well. What happened to me during a solo ascent attempt on Mount of the Holy Cross last winter challenged everything I thought I understood about mountain safety and about the forces that operate in high alpine environments. I had been planning that particular winter ascent for 2 years, waiting for the right combination of weather conditions, snow stability, and availability in my personal schedule. Mount of the Holy Cross is a demanding summit even under normal conditions, and winter attempts require extensive preparation and very careful coordination. The route I had planned would take me through avalanche-prone terrain, but the recent snow conditions appeared stable according to the forecasts from the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. I began my approach on a Thursday morning in early February, carrying full winter mountaineering gear, including avalanche safety equipment, emergency shelter, and enough supplies for 3 days. The weather forecast showed a brief high-pressure window, with clear skies and minimal wind. These were ideal conditions for attempting a winter summit. The first day of climbing went exactly according to plan. I established a high camp at approximately 11,000 feet, well above the tree line, in a place that offered some protection from the prevailing winds while also avoiding known avalanche paths. The afternoon was clear and calm, and all weather indicators suggested stable conditions for attempting the summit the next day. I woke before dawn and began the final push toward the summit at 4 in the morning, ascending by the light of my headlamp through the pre-dawn darkness. The snow conditions were excellent, firm enough to support my weight without requiring excessive energy expenditure. I made good progress along the standard winter route, carefully avoiding areas where avalanche danger might be higher. When the sun rose, I could clearly see the entire route ahead of me. The snow appeared stable across the avalanche zones I would have to cross, and there were no obvious signs of recent activity or unstable conditions. Everything indicated that my assessment had been correct and that reaching the summit could be done safely. It was around 9 in the morning when I began to perceive the warnings. I cannot describe those warnings as sounds or voices in the conventional sense, but I was receiving clear mental impressions that I should not continue climbing. The sensations were urgent and specific, warning me about avalanche danger in areas where my own assessment indicated that the snow was stable. At first, I dismissed those impressions as pre-summit anxiety, something many climbers experience when approaching technically challenging terrain. But as I continued ascending, the warnings became more insistent and precise. I was receiving detailed information about snow conditions, changes in the weather, and hazards on the route that contradicted my own observations and the official avalanche forecasts. The warnings told me that I was entering an avalanche zone where the snow was much less stable than it appeared, and that if I continued, I would be caught in a massive slide that would occur within the next few hours. I stopped and performed a thorough snow stability assessment, digging test pits and carefully examining the layers. Everything I observed confirmed that the snow was stable and that the avalanche risk was minimal. The layers showed good cohesion with one another. There were no obvious weak layers or faceted grains, and the weather conditions did not favor avalanche formation. But the warnings continued, becoming increasingly urgent and detailed. I was receiving specific information about the exact point where the avalanche would start, the size and destructive force of the slide, and even the time when it would occur. According to those warnings, a huge avalanche would sweep across the entire face I was climbing at approximately 11:30 in the morning, triggered by the collapse of a cornice high on the mountain when the sun warmed the snow structures enough. I looked toward the areas where cornices normally form on that summit, but I could not see any obvious instability or signs that a collapse was imminent. The cornices appeared well consolidated, and the warming caused by the morning sun had been gradual and moderate. Despite the fact that my rational assessment told me those warnings had no basis, I found myself unable to continue climbing. The mental impressions were so intense and specific that they overrode my technical knowledge and experience. Against my better judgment, I decided to retreat from the mountain and abandon the summit attempt. I began descending immediately, moving as quickly as safety allowed while maintaining proper climbing technique. As I moved back, the warnings gradually diminished in intensity, although I continued to receive the impression that I needed to move faster and get out of the avalanche zone as soon as possible. I had descended approximately 500 feet when I heard the sound that confirmed the accuracy of those warnings. High above my position, there was a sharp crack, followed by a low rumble that quickly transformed into a roar. A huge cornice had collapsed exactly where and when the warnings had indicated it would, triggering an avalanche that descended across the entire face I had been climbing just minutes earlier. The avalanche was gigantic, much larger than the current snow conditions should have produced. It dragged thousands of tons of snow and debris down the mountainside, completely covering the route I had been following and extending far beyond the typical avalanche zones for that summit. If I had continued climbing according to my original plan, I would have been directly in the path of the avalanche when it occurred. The slide was so large and powerful that survival would have been impossible, regardless of my avalanche safety equipment or emergency procedures. I watched the avalanche from my safe position below the debris zone, stunned by its size and destructive power. In a matter of minutes, the entire character of the mountain had changed, with the avalanche depositing debris over areas that moments earlier had been clear climbing terrain. When the avalanche settled and the mountain returned to silence, I understood that I had been saved by warnings from a source I could not identify or explain. The information I had received was completely accurate and far more detailed than my own knowledge and experience could have provided. I completed my descent to base camp and hiked back to the trailhead, constantly replaying the experience and trying to understand what had happened. I had received specific and correct information about mountain conditions that proved to be true, despite contradicting every conventional assessment method. When I reported the avalanche to the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, the forecasters were surprised by its occurrence and magnitude. According to their analysis, the current snow conditions should not have produced an avalanche of that size, and there were no indicators suggesting that such a slide was likely. The avalanche was ultimately classified as an unusual event, caused by a combination of factors that were not apparent through standard snow stability assessment techniques. The cornice collapse that triggered the slide was attributed to subtle warming effects that could not be detected through normal weather monitoring. I have continued alpine climbing since that experience, but my approach to mountain safety changed fundamentally. I now pay attention to intuitive impressions and warnings that cannot be explained through conventional assessment methods, and I have learned to trust them even when they contradict my technical knowledge. I have spoken with other experienced mountaineers about this experience, and several have shared similar stories of receiving warnings or some kind of guidance that helped them avoid dangerous situations in the mountains. Those experiences suggest that there are sources of information about mountain conditions that operate beyond our normal understanding of weather, snow science, and avalanche dynamics. I do not claim to understand the source of the warnings that saved my life on Mount of the Holy Cross, but I know they were accurate, and that following them prevented me from dying in an avalanche that, according to conventional prediction methods, should not have occurred. The experience taught me that mountain environments operate according to forces and patterns that current scientific knowledge does not fully understand, and that experienced climbers need to remain open to information that comes from sources beyond traditional safety assessment techniques. I still climb regularly on the high peaks of Colorado, but I approach each mountain with greater humility and respect for the unknown variables that can influence safety in high alpine environments. Mountains possess their own intelligence, and sometimes that intelligence communicates with those who are willing to listen. What I know for certain is that there are protective forces operating in mountain environments, forces capable of providing crucial safety information to climbers who find themselves in dangerous situations. Those forces saved my life, and I believe they continue to act for other mountaineers who face conditions that exceed their ability to assess them through conventional means. The avalanche on Mount of the Holy Cross was a reminder that mountains are far more complex and unpredictable than our current understanding suggests, and that survival sometimes depends on receiving and acting on information that comes from sources we cannot identify or explain. Story 7. My name is Chloe, and this story involves my best friend Grace and me during what was supposed to be a week-long canoe expedition through the remote wilderness of northern Ontario, Canada. We are both experienced wilderness canoeists and have completed multiple expeditions through unpopulated territories and difficult remote places. We are familiar with wildlife encounters, proper food storage procedures, and wilderness safety protocols. But what stalked us during our trip into the interior of Quetico Provincial Park was unlike any animal either of us had ever encountered before. Grace and I had been planning this expedition for more than a year, researching remote canoe routes that would take us deep into untouched natural areas rarely visited by other paddlers. The route we chose would require 7 days of paddling and portages through a chain of interconnected lakes and rivers, camping at remote sites accessible only by canoe. We obtained all the necessary permits and prepared thoroughly, including bear safety training and wilderness first aid certification. Our food was stored in approved bear-proof containers, and we carried bear spray, noise-making devices, and other wildlife deterrent equipment. We had paddled together for 6 years and trusted our ability to handle any challenge nature could present to us. We began the expedition on a Monday morning in late August, launching the canoe from a remote access point reached only after driving 2 hours on logging roads. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and calm water, ideal paddling conditions. Our canoe was loaded with 7 days of food, camping gear, and safety equipment, but we had packed efficiently, and the weight was manageable. The first 3 days of the expedition were exactly what we had hoped for. We paddled through pristine wilderness areas, camped at beautiful and secluded sites, and encountered normal wildlife, including moose, beavers, and several species of birds. The signs of bears we observed were minimal and appeared old, suggesting little bear activity in the area. On the fourth day, we paddled into a large lake system that marked the most remote section of our route. According to our maps, we were more than 20 miles from the nearest road access, surrounded by hundreds of square miles of continuous, untouched wilderness. The lake was beautiful, but somehow it felt different from the waters we had been traveling through. It felt more isolated, more wild, and strangely silent despite its size. That afternoon, we set up camp on a small island near the center of the lake. The site offered excellent views in every direction and would allow us to detect any animal approaching long before it could reach our location. We followed our usual routine. We set up camp, hung our food at the required distance and height, and prepared dinner before darkness fell. It was during a dinner preparation that we first noticed something was wrong with the behavior of the local wildlife. The normal sounds of an evening in the wilderness were absent. There were no loons calling, no beavers splashing, no birds settling in for the night. The silence was so absolute that we could hear our own heartbeats, and the small sounds of our activities in camp seemed unnaturally loud. Grace commented that maybe we had arrived during a natural quiet period, but I had spent enough time in wilderness areas to know that this level of silence was unusual. Something had caused all the animals in the area to become inactive or leave entirely. We finished our dinner and our nighttime camp routine, but we both felt uneasy because of that unnatural stillness. We decided to hang the food earlier than usual and keep the bear spray easily accessible throughout the night. Around 10, as we were settling inside the tent, we heard the first sounds indicating that we were not alone on the lake. There were splashes in the water, but they were not the random splashes of fish or beavers. They were rhythmic and deliberate, as if something large were swimming in a straight line toward our island. The splashing continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly when it seemed to reach the shore of our island. Grace and I remained silent inside the tent, listening carefully for any clue as to what had approached our camp. We heard nothing for about 15 minutes. Then we detected sounds of movement in the forest surrounding our campsite. Whatever was circling our camp was large enough to break branches as it moved, but it moved with unusual stealth for something of that size. We could hear occasional footsteps and the sound of vegetation being disturbed. But the movement pattern did not resemble anything we had experienced with bears, moose, or other large animals. The most unsettling thing was that it seemed to be deliberately circling our camp, maintaining a constant distance from our tent while moving systematically around the perimeter. We stayed inside the tent for more than an hour, listening to the sounds of something moving among the trees around us. From time to time, the noises stopped completely, and we wondered if whatever it was had left. But then the movement would begin again, always following the same circular pattern around our camp. Near midnight, Grace whispered that she was going to use her flashlight to try to see what was stalking us. I told her not to do it. I preferred that we remain hidden inside the tent rather than reveal our exact location. But the uncertainty was becoming unbearable, and we needed to know what we were facing. Grace slowly unzipped the tent and pointed the flashlight toward the forest surrounding the camp. The beam of light showed nothing but trees and undergrowth, but at the exact instant the light appeared, all the sounds of movement stopped immediately. We waited 10 minutes before closing the tent, but the forest remained completely silent. Whatever had been circling our camp had either left the area or stopped moving when we tried to observe it. That pattern continued throughout the entire night. Every time we tried to investigate with light, the sounds stopped. Every time we retreated inside the tent and turned off the lights, the movement resumed after a few minutes. By dawn, Grace and I were exhausted and terrified. We had spent the entire night listening to something large and intelligent stalk our camp, but we had not managed to identify what it was or determine its intentions. When sunrise provided enough light to examine the site, we discovered evidence that confirmed our fears about the activity of the previous night. Around our tent, at a constant distance of approximately 30 feet, there was a clear trail where something had been moving in a circle. The route showed disturbed vegetation, broken branches, and occasional impressions in the soft earth, but the tracks did not look like anything either of us had seen before. The marks were large, much larger than the bare paws of a bear or the hooves of a moose, and showed a foot structure that seemed almost human, but with elongated toes and what appeared to be claw marks. The stride length suggested something with very long legs, and the depth of the impressions indicated considerable weight. The most disturbing thing was the intelligence demonstrated by the movement pattern. This was not random animal behavior or territorial marking. Something had deliberately and systematically circled our camp for hours, maintaining a perfect distance and changing direction when it encountered obstacles. Grace and I made the decision to cut the expedition short and paddle back immediately. We broke camp as quickly as we could and loaded the canoe, constantly watching the tree line for any sign of movement or additional wildlife activity. The exit was tense and exhausting. We maintained a fast pace, stopping only when necessary for portages and navigation. Throughout the entire day, we had the feeling that we were being watched, although we never saw direct evidence that something was following us. During one of the portages, Grace discovered additional tracks similar to the ones we had found at our camp. The marks went from the water's edge to the portage trail and then returned to the water on the other side. Something had been following the same route we were using, and it had been there recently. We completed the portage as quickly as possible and kept paddling, forcing ourselves to cover more distance than we had planned for a single day. By evening, we reached a lake system that was only one day of paddling from our exit point, but we decided to continue paddling through the night instead of camping in the wilderness again. Using our headlamps and following the GPS, we paddled through the darkness until we reached the last lake before our exit point. We made a cold camp on a small island, taking turns staying awake and watching for any sign that we were still being followed. The night passed without incident, and we completed the exit the next morning, reaching our vehicle and civilization with profound relief. When we reported our experience to park authorities, they listened carefully but offered no explanation for what we had encountered. They did point out that there had been other reports of unusual wildlife activity in the same area, including tracks that did not match known species and sightings of large animals that could not be identified with certainty. Grace and I still take canoe trips together, but we have never returned to that area of northern Ontario. The experience fundamentally changed our understanding of what exists in Canada's deep wilderness areas, and we now plan our routes more carefully to avoid areas with reports of unusual animal activity. What stalked us during those 2 nights was something that combined the size and strength of a large predator with intelligence and behavior patterns that seemed almost human. It demonstrated patience, systematic thinking, and an understanding of our routines that went far beyond the normal behavior of any animal. I do not know what species we encountered in the Quetico wilderness, but I know it was real and that it represented a considerable threat to our safety. The remote areas of northern Canada contain mysteries that do not appear in any wildlife management guide, and canoeists who venture into those places must be prepared for encounters that cannot be explained through conventional understanding of animal behavior. Story 8. My name is Luke, and this is a different story from the one I shared earlier about high-altitude mountaineering. This experience happened during a winter overlanding expedition along remote Forest Service roads in northwestern Montana, where I had traveled to photograph wildlife during the harshest months of winter. I am a photographer and outdoor enthusiast with experience in winter conditions. I have spent countless nights alone inside my vehicle in isolated places. But what happened to me over 3 days while I was trapped by snow on a Forest Service road near Glacier National Park challenged my understanding of what exists deep in the wilderness during Montana's brutal winters. I had driven north from Missoula in early January, looking for opportunities to photograph wolves, mountain goats, and other animals that become more visible during the winter months, when snow forces them down to lower elevations. My plan was to explore a network of Forest Service roads that provided access to wildlife habitats, while allowing me to sleep in my truck, which was equipped with a camper shell, a sleeping system, and emergency supplies for prolonged winter camping. My vehicle was a heavy-duty pickup truck with 4-wheel drive, snow tires, and recovery equipment. I carried enough food, water, and fuel for 2 weeks of self-sufficient camping, along with cold weather gear appropriate for Montana winter conditions. I also had communication equipment, including a satellite messenger and an emergency beacon. The Forest Service road I chose provided access to high elevation areas that remained open to vehicle traffic during the winter, although they were rarely used because of the difficult snow conditions. According to my research, that road offered access to ideal wildlife habitat and numerous camping opportunities for self-sufficient vehicles. I drove into the mountains on a Tuesday morning, following the main cleared road until I reached the turnoff into the Forest Service road system. The secondary roads had not been plowed, but they were passable with four-wheel drive and showed signs of occasional use by other winter recreationists. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. I found several excellent places for wildlife photography and established temporary camps from which I could observe animal activity during the early morning hours and at dusk, when the animals were most active. The weather was cold but stable, with temperatures ranging from -10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit above zero. On Thursday morning, I drove deeper into the Forest Service road network, following increasingly narrow and demanding routes toward areas that, according to my maps, provided access to remote wilderness boundaries. The snow was deeper at the higher elevations, but my truck handled the conditions without difficulty. Around midday, I stopped to photograph a herd of elk feeding in a meadow visible from the road. As I prepared my photography equipment, light snow began to fall. The forecast had mentioned a chance of snow, but nothing that could create travel problems. However, the snowfall intensified quickly during the afternoon. What had begun as light flakes turned into dense snow that significantly reduced visibility and began accumulating on the roads. By 4 in the afternoon, I realized I needed to start driving back toward the main road before the roads became impassable. But when I tried to leave, I discovered that the snow had already turned the Forest Service roads into extremely difficult routes to travel. My truck slipped and slid even with four-wheel drive engaged, and I moved very slowly toward the main road system. The snow continued falling heavily, and I could see that the situation was deteriorating quickly. As darkness approached, I made the decision to stop and wait for better conditions instead of risking getting stuck or sliding off the narrow mountain roads. I found a relatively level area where I could park safely and activated my emergency beacon to notify authorities of my location and situation. I settled inside the truck for what I hoped would be an uncomfortable but manageable night, intending to try to leave in the morning when I could clearly see the road conditions. My vehicle was well prepared for winter camping, and I had been through similar situations before without serious problems. The snow continued falling all night, and by morning I discovered that my truck was partially buried and the roads were completely impossible to travel. The storm had left more than 2 feet of new snow, and the Forest Service roads would need to be cleared by machinery or wait for significant warming before they could be used safely. I activated my satellite communicator and reported my situation to emergency services, providing my GPS coordinates and explaining that I was safe but would need help getting out of the area. I was told that road crews would clear the Forest Service roads as soon as weather conditions allowed, but that it could take several days depending on whether the snow continued. That was disappointing but not alarming. I had supplies for 2 weeks and was comfortable inside my vehicle. I had been in similar situations before and knew that patience was necessary when winter weather created travel problems in remote places. But during the second night trapped by the snow, I began to experience something that transformed a routine winter camping situation into a terrifying survival ordeal. Around midnight, I was awakened by sounds outside my truck that seemed like human voices calling my name. The voices were distant but clear, and they came from different directions around the place where I was camped. They said Luke again and again, sometimes individually and other times in overlapping conversations. That was impossible. I was miles from any other person, trapped by snow on a remote Forest Service road that had been impassable for 2 days. There was no way anyone else could have reached my location on foot through deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. I stayed inside my sleeping bag, listening carefully and trying to determine the origin of the voices. They continued for approximately 20 minutes, sometimes seeming to come closer to my truck and other times fading into the distance. The voices sounded urgent, as if people were searching for me and calling for me to answer. Despite the apparent urgency, there was something about them that felt wrong. The tone was too perfect, too consistent, as if someone were imitating human speech rather than speaking naturally, and the fact that they knew my name was deeply disturbing. since no one else should have known I was in that remote place. I decided not to respond. Instead, I stayed quiet and hidden inside the truck. After approximately half an hour, the call stopped completely, and the forest returned to its normal winter silence. The next night, the voices returned, but this time they were closer and more persistent. They seemed to come from just outside the truck, and they were no longer limited to calling my name, but took part in conversations that seemed designed to trick me into responding. The voices said my name, then paused as if waiting for an answer. When I stayed silent, they began speaking among themselves, discussing my situation and expressing concern for my well-being. They mentioned details about my location and circumstances that no one should have known. The most disturbing part was when the voices began to imitate people I knew. I heard conversations that sounded like members of my family and friends, talking about plans to rescue me and asking me to get out of the truck so they could help me. The imitations were almost perfect, capturing speech patterns and vocal characteristics with enough accuracy to be convincing. But I knew none of those people could be there, in that remote place, during a winter storm. The voices were attempts to lure me out of the safety of my vehicle, although I could not determine who or what was producing those sounds, or why it wanted me to leave the truck. Throughout the third night, the voices became more aggressive and desperate. They began claiming that there was an emergency, that someone was hurt and needed my help, that search and rescue teams were nearby and needed me to signal my location. The urgency in those voices was convincing, and there were moments when I almost persuaded myself that I should investigate. But something deeper than rational thought warned me that I had to remain hidden in the truck. Every instinct I had developed during years of wilderness experience told me that responding to those voices would be dangerous, no matter how believable they sounded. The voices continued until dawn, sometimes moving away into the distance, and other times seeming to come directly from outside my windows. From time to time, I heard sounds of movement around the truck, as if people were walking through the deep snow and examining my vehicle. But when I looked through the windows, I never saw anyone or found tracks in the snow around my camp area. On the fourth morning, I heard the sound of real human voices and machinery approaching my location. A search and rescue team had reached me using snowmobiles and a tracked vehicle, following the GPS coordinates I had sent through my satellite communicator. The rescue team was able to clear enough snow around my truck to allow me to drive behind their tracked vehicle, following the route they had opened through the deep snow. The evacuation went smoothly, and I reached the main road system without further incident. When I described the voices I had heard during the previous 3 nights, the search and rescue coordinator told me they had received similar reports from other people who had become stranded alone in remote places during winter. He could not explain the phenomenon, but said that people who spend prolonged periods isolated in extreme winter conditions sometimes experience auditory hallucinations or other perceptual disturbances. That explanation might have convinced me, if not for one detail the rescue team discovered when they examined my camp. Around my truck, at distances ranging from 20 to 50 feet, there were tracks in the snow that appeared to have been made by people walking in circles around the vehicle. The marks were clear and well-defined, showing boot prints and patterns that suggested systematic surveillance of the place where I was camped. But according to the rescue team, no search and rescue member had reached my location before that morning. The tracks had been made by unknown individuals who had somehow reached my remote location during the storm and had spent considerable time observing my truck. I never received a satisfactory explanation for the voices or the tracks. The experience convinced me that remote places in Montana during the winter can contain activities and encounters that are not covered by any wilderness safety training, and that survival sometimes requires ignoring seemingly human voices calling from the darkness.